You could hear the crack echo in the courtroom. So sharp, so humiliating, that for a split second, the world seemed to freeze. A black woman, standing alone, facing not just the weight of the legal system but the weight of centuries of prejudice, had just been struck in open court. People gasped, others turned away, and some pretended nothing had happened. That's the thing about injustice. It doesn't always happen in the shadows. Sometimes, it plays out in the blinding light of day, in front of everyone, daring them to do something about it. But what nobody in that room could imagine, not the officers, not the smug prosecutor, not even the audience who had resigned themselves to silence, was that the same woman humiliated in that moment would one day rise higher than all of them. They thought they were breaking her. Instead, they were forging her. The very hands that tried to keep her down would end up trembling when she walked in wearing the robe they never expected her to wear. The judge's robe. Before we dive deeper into this incredible journey, her pain, her silence, her fire, and her rise, I need you to do something important. If stories like this one move you, if they make you reflect, if they shake something inside you that refuses to accept injustice as just the way things are, then hit that subscribe button right now. Drop a comment telling me what you think so far, and don't forget to like this video. It tells the system we're still watching and we're not looking away. Now back to the story. The woman's name was never written on the front pages of newspapers that day. She wasn't famous. She wasn't powerful. She was ordinary in the eyes of those who judged her, which made it easier for them to treat her as disposable. She came into that courtroom with quiet dignity, wearing clothes that had been pressed the night before, hoping maybe, just maybe, justice would look her in the eyes. But instead of fairness, she was met with arrogance, hostility, and a slap that would echo far beyond that day. She didn't scream. That silence was her power. The officers who hit her expected rage. They expected tears, maybe begging, maybe collapse. What they got instead was a woman who stood straighter, whose eyes locked with theirs, unflinching. That silence was louder than any cry for help, louder than any words of defense. It was the silence of someone who had already been carrying the weight of the world, and one more blow wasn't going to break her. It was going to harden her resolve. Think about this. How many people in that room convinced themselves they had no choice but to look away? How many told themselves, "It's not my fight"? That's how injustice survives, not because of the strength of the oppressor, but because of the silence of the bystanders. And yet, in this case, silence also became her weapon. She didn't fight the battle in that moment. She stored it. She let the humiliation burn into memory, shaping a vow deep inside. Never again. There's something powerful about pain. It carves pathways inside us. For some, it becomes a prison. For others, it becomes a map. For her, that day in court was both a wound and a compass. Every step she took afterward, every book she studied, every late night she spent poring over cases, was fueled by the slap meant to silence her. What was supposed to keep her down became the very reason she rose. You see, the road from that courtroom to the judge's chair wasn't straight, and it wasn't easy. It was a war against doubt, against poverty, against the whispered voices that told her she'd never be more than a statistic. And yet, she moved forward, not with the bitterness they expected, but with a sharp, quiet focus. Because deep down, she knew the system that had humiliated her would one day have to call her Your Honor. Long before that slap in the courtroom, she had already learned what it meant to be underestimated. She grew up in a neighborhood where opportunity wasn't just scarce. It was a rumor, something people talked about but few had ever seen. The streets were cracked, the schools underfunded, and every day felt like a negotiation with survival. When you grow up in a place like that, you're told in 1,000 subtle ways that your life is worth less than someone else's. Not with words, but with the peeling paint on the school walls, the empty shelves in the library, and the way teachers sometimes looked at you like you were already a lost cause. And yet, she wasn't lost. Not then, not ever. Even as a child, she carried herself with an unusual kind of defiance. Not the loud, reckless kind that gets you in trouble, but the quiet, steady kind that unsettles people. She asked questions no one expected her to ask. Why do some neighborhoods have parks and others don't? Why do some kids get tutors while others barely get textbooks? Why do some judges see humanity in one defendant and statistics in another? These weren't the questions of a child content with her place in the world. They were the questions of someone already preparing to challenge it. Still, asking questions didn't shield her from the harsh realities. There were nights when she had to choose between finishing homework by candlelight or helping her mother clean houses just to put food on the table. There were mornings when the sound of sirens outside the window became her alarm clock. There were afternoons when she'd watch friends disappear into the system, locked away before they even had a chance to live. Each of those experiences became a scar, and each scar became a reason. See, pain is a strange teacher. It can break you down, strip away your confidence, and leave you with nothing but fear. But if you listen carefully, pain can also whisper the truth. You're stronger than they want you to believe. She listened. She turned those whispers into fuel. While others expected her to give up, she doubled down. She studied harder. She worked longer. She learned to keep her head low when necessary, but never to let go of the vision she carried. A life not defined by survival, but by purpose. And then came the moment that would change everything. Her first encounter with the justice system, not as an observer, but as someone standing in front of it. It wasn't the slap in the courtroom, not yet, that came later. This was earlier, smaller in scale, but just as cutting. She watched someone she loved, her brother, get dragged into the system for something trivial, a mistake blown out of proportion. The way they treated him, the way they dismissed her family's pleas, burned itself into her memory. She saw, with horrifying clarity, that justice wasn't blind. It saw color, it saw poverty, it saw weakness, and it exploited all three. That day, she made a promise. She wouldn't just survive this system. She would learn it, master it, and one day, stand over it. Because the only way to truly fight injustice is to know its playbook, page by page. Years later, when that officer's hand struck her in the courtroom, she wasn't just a victim. She was a witness to a pattern she already understood too well. And she also knew every strike, every humiliation, every act of disrespect was part of the same machinery. But machines, no matter how big, can be dismantled. And she would dedicate her life to dismantling this one, piece by piece. Imagine this for a moment. A young black girl, walking home from school, carrying books that weighed more than her shoulders could bear, repeating to herself words she barely believed yet desperately needed. One day, I'll be more than this. One day, I'll sit where they don't want me to sit. It sounds impossible, doesn't it? And yet, impossibility is often the first ingredient of transformation. Her story wasn't about luck. It wasn't about being in the right place at the right time. It was about grit, vision, and an unshakable belief that even the most broken system could be forced to make space for justice. The same courtroom where she was humiliated would one day rise to its feet when she walked in. Not as a defendant, not as a victim, but as a judge. The decision to pursue law didn't come easy. For someone like her, it wasn't a straight line from high school to college, from college to law school. It was a maze, full of dead ends, locked doors, and voices telling her she didn't belong. Still, she pressed forward, not because the path was clear, but because the alternative was unacceptable. She refused to remain silent while injustice reigned. Money was the first obstacle. Law school isn't just expensive. It's designed to keep people like her out. The tuition, the books, the endless fees, they stacked up like walls. But she learned early on that walls are only as strong as your refusal to climb them. She worked jobs most students wouldn't dare to take. Nights spent cleaning offices, weekends waiting tables, early mornings helping her mother with house cleaning. Each dollar earned was a brick laid on the foundation of her future. But money wasn't the only challenge. The second obstacle was belonging, or rather, the lack of it. From the moment she walked into her first law lecture, she could feel the eyes. Some were curious, some hostile, some dismissive. She was the outlier, the one student who didn't fit the mold. When professors spoke of legal theory detached from human suffering, she felt the sting of every case they reduced to academic jargon. She wasn't reading these cases from a distance. She had lived them. Every statistic about poverty or incarceration was a story she could put a name to, and that, strangely enough, became her advantage. Where others memorized, she internalized. Where others debated hypotheticals, she carried the weight of reality. While they quoted textbooks, she quoted life. Slowly, she stopped seeing her difference as a weakness and started seeing it as her power. She wasn't there to play their game. She was there to rewrite it. Law school, though, wasn't only about studying. It was about survival in an environment that often sought to remind her she was lucky to be there. Lucky, as though hard work and brilliance weren't part of the equation. Lucky, as though her presence was an exception instead of a right. Those comments could have broken her. Instead, they sharpened her. Every smirk, every dismissive remark, every time someone assumed she was only there because of a diversity quota, she turned into fuel. If they underestimated her, so be it. She would make them regret it. And then there were the professors, the ones who, intentionally or not, played gatekeepers. Some encouraged her, recognizing her fire. Others, they saw her as a disruption to the status quo. They challenged her more harshly than others, cut her off mid-argument, dismissed her points as emotional instead of legal. But law isn't just logic on paper, it's justice in practice. And if justice ignores emotion, then justice isn't real. That became her edge. She argued cases not only with intellect but with humanity. Outside the classroom, she started volunteering. Legal aid clinics, community centers, anywhere she could apply what she was learning to real lives. She saw firsthand how the system preyed on ignorance, how it thrived when people didn't know their rights. She watched single mothers lose their homes, teenagers get railroaded into plea deals, families ripped apart, all because they didn't have anyone to fight for them. And each time, she thought back to that courtroom, to that slap, to that silence. She vowed, "I will be their voice. I will be the judge who listens." But ambition alone doesn't win battles. She stumbled. She failed exams she thought she'd aced. She broke down under the weight of exhaustion. There were nights when she questioned everything, when the dream seemed too heavy, too far, too impossible. What kept her going wasn't certainty but stubbornness. She had already come too far to stop. Every setback became another scar, another reminder that resilience is forged in fire, not in comfort. By the time she reached the end of law school, she wasn't the same woman who walked in. She was sharper, stronger, and more dangerous to the system that had once tried to silence her. And more than anything, she had begun to notice something crucial: cracks. For all its power, the system wasn't perfect. It was run by people, flawed, biased, inconsistent people. And cracks, no matter how small, can be widened with enough pressure. That became her strategy, not to fight the system head-on, but to slip through its cracks and expand them until the whole structure shook. When she passed the bar exam, it wasn't just a personal victory. It was a declaration of war. The courtroom where she'd once been humiliated was no longer foreign territory. It was her battlefield, and she was ready to step into it, not as a victim, but as a force the system had never prepared for. The day she walked into court as a lawyer for the very first time, the air felt different. She wasn't there as a defendant or a bystander or a silent witness to injustice. She was there to speak, to argue, to fight. And yet, the weight of those stares was all too familiar. The same skeptical eyes that had followed her through law school now followed her into the courtroom. Some of the older attorneys smirked, whispering as if she couldn't hear. To them, she was inexperienced, out of place, a novelty. But what they didn't realize was that her very presence in that courtroom was already a victory. Every step she took in those polished heels across the marble floor was an act of defiance. Her first case wasn't glamorous. It wasn't a headline grabber or a career maker. It was a tenant dispute, a mother being evicted with her children in the dead of winter. For some lawyers, this was small-time work, something to cut their teeth on before moving up to the important cases. But for her, it was everything, because this wasn't abstract. It was personal. She knew what it felt like to live on the edge of eviction, to watch the walls close in and wonder if tomorrow you'd still have a home. She prepared like the fate of the world depended on it. She pored over case law, statutes, precedents. But more importantly, she listened to the client, to the children's stories, to the unspoken fear in their eyes. When she stood in front of the judge, she wasn't just presenting legal arguments. She was carrying the weight of that family's survival. The opposing lawyer underestimated her, brushing off her passion as naivete. But passion paired with precision is a dangerous thing. When she spoke, every word landed like a stone against glass. By the end of it, the eviction was halted. The family walked out with their dignity intact. That victory wasn't just for them. It was for her. It was proof that she could bend the system, even if just a little, toward justice. And once you taste that kind of victory, you can't stop. But victories came with enemies. For every client she helped, there was someone in power who felt threatened. Landlords, corporations, prosecutors, they began to recognize her name, and not with fondness. She got used to the whispers. She's too aggressive. She doesn't know her place. She's emotional. The system has always had names for women like her, and she wore every insult like armor. Then came her first criminal defense case, the kind that could make or break a young lawyer. A teenager accused of theft. The evidence was thin, circumstantial at best, but the system didn't care. The boy was poor, black, and easy to label as guilty. Most expected her to push for a plea deal, but she saw herself in him, the weight of being judged before you even opened your mouth. She refused to accept easy. She fought, tooth and nail, challenging every piece of flimsy evidence, every biased assumption, every corner the prosecution tried to cut. And when the jury came back with not guilty, the boy's mother broke down in tears, clutching her hand as though she had just saved her entire family. Moments like that fueled her, but they also painted a target on her back. The more she won, the more the system pushed back. Judges dismissed her arguments before she finished them. Opposing counsel tried to rattle her with condescension. Some days, it felt like she was fighting not just the case in front of her, but the entire weight of a system determined to remind her of her place. And yet, something remarkable happened. People noticed. Word began to spread in the community. If you wanted someone who would actually listen, who would actually fight, you called her. She became the lawyer for the unheard, the ignored, the discarded. And with every case, her reputation grew, not just as a lawyer, but as a force of nature. Still, she wasn't satisfied. Winning cases was important, yes, but she wanted more than victories. She wanted transformation. She knew that as long as she was a lawyer, she could only fight case by case, one family, one client at a time. And while each win mattered, the system remained largely intact. To change it, she realized, she would need to step into a different kind of power. It was then that the idea first entered her mind. Like a whisper she almost didn't dare to say out loud. What if I became a judge? The thought came quietly at first, almost like an intruder in her mind. After all, who was she to think about wearing the robe, about holding the gavel, about sitting higher than those who had once tried to crush her? Judges weren't like her, at least not the ones she'd seen. They were men, older, white, seasoned in the comfort of privilege. They weren't women who carried scars, who knew the sound of sirens as lullabies, who remembered the sting of being silenced. And yet, the idea refused to leave. Every time she walked into a courtroom, standing before a judge who treated defendants like numbers instead of people, the whisper grew louder. What if it were me up there? What if someone who actually understood the weight of injustice held the power to decide? At first, she dismissed it as impossible. She was too young, too inexperienced, too different. The voice of doubt was constant, reminding her of every barrier, every stereotype, every reason she shouldn't even dare to try. But the more cases she took, the more clients she defended, the more she realized something. The courtroom didn't need another judge who looked like the last one. It needed someone who broke the mold. The turning point came one evening, long after midnight, when she sat alone in her tiny office surrounded by stacks of case files. She was exhausted, drained from another brutal day in court. But instead of despair, she felt something else rising inside her, a vision. She closed her eyes and imagined the same courtroom where she'd once been struck, but from a different angle. She wasn't at the defense table anymore. She was on the bench, her voice carrying authority, her presence commanding respect. The people who had once ignored her couldn't look away. And for the first time, she didn't feel like an imposter in that vision. She felt like it was inevitable. Still, dreams don't come without sacrifice. The road to the bench wasn't paved for her. It required political backing, endorsements, relentless networking. All arenas where she was, once again, the outsider. But if life had taught her anything, it was that outsiders have a way of finding cracks to slip through. She began showing up at community events, volunteering her time, not for recognition but because she believed in being present where justice was absent. People noticed. The same families she had defended spread her name like wildfire. She's different. She listens. She fights. She cares. Of course, not everyone was thrilled. Her ambition threatened the established order. Other lawyers scoffed at the idea. Judges smirked when they heard her name floated as a candidate. Some even told her directly, "People like you don't become judges." And in a twisted way, those words became her fuel. Every time someone said she couldn't, she thought back to that slap in the courtroom. If she had survived that humiliation, what was a few sneers compared to it? She doubled down. She studied not only the law but the path others had taken to the bench. She built alliances, sometimes with people she didn't like but needed to win over. She learned the language of politics without losing the fire of her mission. And slowly, the impossible began to look less impossible. But ambition doesn't shield you from fear. There were nights when she questioned if she was betraying her roots by stepping into a position of authority. Would she become like the judges she despised, aloof, detached, blinded by power? Could she carry her community with her? Or would she be forced to leave it behind? These doubts haunted her, but deep down, she knew the answer. She wasn't fighting to be a judge for herself. She was fighting for every client she couldn't save, every case she lost, every child who walked into a courtroom already labeled guilty. She wanted to be the one who saw them, truly saw them, in a system that made them invisible. And so the decision was made. She wouldn't just be a lawyer in the trenches. She would hire, risk more, and step into a role few believed she could ever hold. The same courtroom that once broke her would one day rise in silence as she took the bench. Not because the system wanted her there, but because she refused to stay anywhere else. Running for judge was unlike anything she had ever done before. It wasn't about arguing in front of a jury or dismantling a prosecutor's weak case. This was politics, and politics had its own language, a language that didn't always care about truth or justice. It cared about image, influence, and money. She had never had much of any of those things. But what she did have was something far rarer: authenticity. And authenticity, when wielded with courage, has a way of shaking even the most rigid systems. Her campaign started small. A handful of friends, some community leaders she had helped along the way, a few flyers printed on cheap paper. While her opponents held lavish fundraisers in hotel ballrooms, she was knocking on doors, speaking at churches, meeting people face-to-face in community centers. She didn't have millions to spend, but she had stories, real ones. She reminded people of cases she had fought, families she had defended, voices she had amplified when no one else listened. The response was electric. People were hungry for someone who wasn't polished into emptiness, who didn't speak in rehearsed sound bites but in words that cut straight to the bone. For every person who told her she couldn't win, there were two more who whispered, "We need you there." But with visibility came enemies. The establishment didn't take her lightly. Her opponents painted her as radical, unfit, inexperienced. They dug into her past, twisting stories, magnifying every mistake, every stumble, every imperfection. The headlines didn't call her ambitious. They called her angry. They didn't call her determined. They called her unstable. They didn't see a qualified lawyer with a vision. They saw a black woman daring to demand power, and that alone was enough to make them tremble. The pressure was relentless. Campaign events turned hostile. Protesters shouted at her. Donors backed out at the last minute. And even some people she once considered allies warned her to step back, to wait her turn. But if life had taught her anything, it was that turns aren't given to people like her. They have to be taken. She leaned into the fire. Every insult, every smear, every attempt to tear her down became part of her message. They don't want me on the bench because they know I won't play by their rules. They know I'll see the humanity in people they prefer to discard. They know I won't bow to the same powers that have always dictated justice. And people listened. Crowds that once numbered in the dozens grew into hundreds. Her campaign, once seen as a long shot, began to feel unstoppable. Still, the obstacles were real. Money, always money, was her Achilles heel. Her opponents plastered the city with billboards, television ads, radio spots. She had none of that. What she had instead were voices. Community leaders, pastors, mothers, activists, who spread her name from mouth to mouth, block to block. They couldn't buy airtime, but they could tell the truth. And truth, once unleashed, spreads faster than any advertisement. There were nights she nearly broke under the weight of it all. Nights when exhaustion swallowed her whole, when fear whispered that maybe her critics were right, maybe she was reaching too far. But every time doubt crept in, she thought back to the courtroom where she was slapped, the humiliation that sparked her fire. She reminded herself that this wasn't just about her. It was about every person silenced, dismissed, discarded by the very system she was now daring to enter. And then came the debates. Standing on stage beside her opponents, she didn't have the polished answers or the rehearsed smiles. What she had was raw truth. While others spoke in legal jargon and political cliches, she spoke like someone who had lived it because she had. The crowd could feel the difference. When she spoke, silence fell, not out of politeness but out of resonance. It was the kind of silence that says, finally, someone gets it. The momentum was undeniable. What began as whispers of support had grown into a roar. She wasn't just a candidate anymore. She was a movement. And movements have a way of scaring those in power. Her opponents doubled down, pulling every string they could, trying to block her path. But what they didn't realize was that once you give people a glimpse of hope, you can't take it back. The campaign was brutal, but it was also transformative. She discovered a strength she didn't know she had. A resilience forged not just from her own scars, but from the collective scars of her community. She wasn't walking alone anymore. Every step she took was carried by the voices of those who believed in her. And slowly, the impossible dream of sitting in the judge's chair began to feel not only possible, but inevitable. The silence in that courtroom had grown heavier than chains. Every eye was still locked on her, trying to decide whether she belonged there or whether this was some kind of elaborate prank that had gone too far. But the woman didn't flinch. She adjusted her robe the way she had seen judges do countless times before, squared her shoulders, and leaned forward slightly, resting her hands firmly on the bench. She looked like she had been waiting for this seat her entire life. And perhaps, in a way, she had. You see, stories like this aren't just about what happened on that one day. They're about everything that led to it. The broken roads she had walked, the nights she spent studying until her eyes blurred, the battles she fought against doubt, poverty, and prejudice. Those cops thought they had reduced her to nothing with that slap, but they had only ignited something far more dangerous, her refusal to stay down. Because when a system pushes someone hard enough, when it slams doors in their face over and over again, sometimes that person learns to build their own door. And that's exactly what she did. She had been underestimated before. Teachers who thought she wasn't capable. Employers who assumed she was just another face to overlook. Strangers who treated her accent like a punchline. And now, cops who thought a courtroom was their playground, a place where they could intimidate without consequence. But she had absorbed every slight, every insult, every slap, real or metaphorical, and turned them into fuel. That's the thing about people who are constantly underestimated. They become masters at surprising the world. The courtroom began to stir. Whispers spread like fire in dry grass. "Is this even allowed?" One man muttered. "Who does she think she is?" Another asked, though his voice carried more awe than disdain. She didn't answer those whispers directly. Instead, she lifted the gavel. The weight of it seemed almost symbolic, the power of justice, the authority of law, condensed into a single object. When she brought it down against the sound block, the crack that echoed through the room was louder than the slap she had endured just minutes earlier. And in that moment, everyone understood. The power dynamic had shifted. But here's the deeper truth most people miss. This wasn't just about a dramatic reversal of roles. It was about the idea that dignity, once reclaimed, can never be taken away again. The slap had humiliated her publicly, but her decision to take the bench had transformed that humiliation into triumph. She wasn't sitting there to play pretend. She was sitting there because she knew she had earned the right, even if the system hadn't yet recognized it officially. And sometimes, the act of occupying a space before it's granted to you is what forces the world to finally acknowledge that you belong there. Imagine being one of those cops in that moment. Imagine realizing that your attempt to break someone had instead set the stage for their rise. That's a humiliation far deeper than any slap could ever deliver. Because power, once exposed as fragile, is nearly impossible to restore. They had thought themselves untouchable. And yet, with one bold act, she had shattered that illusion in front of an entire courtroom. People wouldn't forget what they saw that day. They wouldn't forget her. And that was more powerful than any official title could have been. As the gavel's echo faded, she finally spoke. Her voice was calm, steady, but filled with a weight that demanded attention. She didn't need to shout. She didn't need to threaten. The very act of her speaking from that chair was enough. And while her exact words may have varied depending on who tells the story, the sentiment remained the same. Respect, dignity, and justice are not privileges to be handed out by those in power. They are rights that can be claimed, even in the most unlikely of places. The lesson in her act was subtle but unshakable. Authority doesn't always come from a title, a badge, or a uniform. Sometimes it comes from the courage to stand, or in this case, to sit where no one expects you to. And when you do it with conviction, even the people who doubt you can't help but recognize the truth staring them in the face. That day in court was never just about her. It was about everyone who had ever been silenced, dismissed, or struck down, literally or figuratively. It was about proving that even in the places designed to intimidate, there is still room for defiance, for transformation, for justice to take an unexpected shape. And though her time in that chair might have been brief, the image of her sitting there lived on like a ghost haunting the halls of that courthouse, a reminder that power can be challenged and redefined in the blink of an eye. The room had fallen into a stunned silence, the kind that precedes both awe and fear. Every person present, the officers, the attorneys, even the spectators who had only come to watch routine proceedings, felt the sudden shift in the atmosphere. What had been a space of authority for them was no longer theirs alone. She had rewritten the rules in mere seconds. And for the first time, everyone could feel it. This wasn't just a performance. This was real, and it was irreversible. Her first ruling was simple yet profound. A minor case, something any other judge would have glanced over. Yet she treated it with the gravity it deserved. She didn't just recite the law. She applied it with empathy, with understanding of human nuance, of context, of life outside the rigid statutes. Her words carried weight because they were grounded in lived experience. The officers who had struck her, sitting stiffly in their chairs, realized that their intimidation had failed. Their previous authority, which relied on fear and submission, dissolved in the presence of someone who refused to be intimidated. And the whispers began. At first, quiet murmurs. "Did you see that? She actually did it." Then louder, more insistent. "Who is she? She's not like any judge I've ever seen." The courtroom, designed to maintain order and decorum, was now buzzing with the electricity of something unprecedented. People were witnessing the collision of audacity and justice, and it was electrifying. They could feel that the rules had changed, if only slightly, in that single act. She wasn't naive. She knew this bold action would come with consequences. There would be pushback, criticisms, even attempts to discredit her. But she had calculated the risk, and she was willing to accept it. The alternative, remaining silent, remaining in her assigned place, continuing to be underestimated, was far more dangerous. Courage isn't the absence of fear. It's acting despite it, and she embodied that principle in every word, every movement, every decision she made that day. The ripple effects extended beyond the courtroom. Lawyers began calling her in for cases with increased respect. Clients felt emboldened, believing that justice might finally be on their side. And though some colleagues tried to diminish her actions with whispers and gossip, the truth had already taken hold. She had claimed a space that had been denied to her, and in doing so, she had shown others that they, too, could challenge their limitations. Her personal transformation was just as significant. Sitting in that chair, she finally understood the full measure of her journey. Every obstacle she had faced, the slaps, the sneers, the dismissals, had been preparing her for this moment. Pain had been her tutor, and perseverance her companion. She realized that power isn't given. It's earned, demanded, and occasionally seized. And the greatest power lies not in revenge, but in demonstrating that those who tried to diminish you have only strengthened your resolve. Outside the courtroom, the story spread like wildfire. Social media buzzed with footage and anecdotes. News outlets scrambled to cover what seemed like a remarkable act of defiance. But for her, the victory wasn't about fame. It was about signaling a broader truth. The system could be challenged, could be disrupted, and people who had been dismissed, silenced, or overlooked had more strength than they realized. She had become not only a symbol of justice but a beacon of possibility. Yet, she remained grounded. She knew that the gavel wasn't a shield, that respect isn't granted permanently, and that every ruling carried the weight of her conscience. The true test of her authority wouldn't be the audacity of her first moments in that seat. It would be the consistency of her fairness, the integrity of her judgments, and the ability to wield power without losing sight of the people she served. And in that knowledge, she found both purpose and peace. The courtroom may have been shocked that day, but she had anticipated every reaction. Every doubt, every whisper, every attempt to undermine her had been accounted for in the meticulous preparation and lifelong training that had brought her there. She wasn't just surviving, she was thriving. She was not only asserting her place, she was redefining what it meant to hold it. The weeks that followed were nothing short of transformative. What began as a single moment, a decision to claim the judge's chair, rippled far beyond the courtroom walls. Colleagues who had once dismissed her began to reconsider their assumptions. Some still approached her with skepticism, but even they had to acknowledge a new reality. She wasn't here to fit in. She was here to change the narrative. Every ruling she made carried the weight of her lived experience, reminding everyone that justice is not a cold, impersonal process, but a human one. Her impact on the legal system was subtle at first, then unmistakable. Minor procedures became more transparent. Cases previously overlooked received careful attention. Judges began to take note of her approach, realizing that empathy, combined with precise legal reasoning, actually elevated the authority of the court rather than diminished it. In essence, she had shown that respect for the law and respect for the people it served were not mutually exclusive. They were, in fact, inseparable. The community's response was even more profound. Families who had felt invisible or abandoned by the system now saw a reflection of themselves in her presence. People whispered, sometimes with tears in their eyes, that for the first time they felt heard. They weren't just spectators to justice, they were participants in it. Her rise inspired others to challenge limitations in their own lives, to question injustices, and to pursue their goals, no matter how unlikely they seemed. Schools, community organizations, and even local leaders began citing her story as proof that barriers could be overcome, that audacity could rewrite destiny. But this visibility also intensified scrutiny. Opponents tried to find fault, searching for any misstep to discredit her. Media outlets dissected her decisions, sometimes misrepresenting her intent, while certain factions in the legal establishment murmured about her unconventional style. She knew the pressure wasn't just professional, it was existential. Every decision she made could be used to either elevate her legacy or tarnish it. Yet she welcomed the challenge. She understood that the path of change was rarely comfortable, and influence is never quietly earned. She also began mentoring younger attorneys, especially those from marginalized backgrounds. She shared her insights, not just about law, but about resilience, courage, and vision. Every conversation was a blueprint for empowerment. When she spoke about the courtroom, she didn't just describe legal procedures. She told stories of standing up when the world doubted you, of turning humiliation into momentum, of claiming spaces that society had tried to deny you. Her mentorship became a movement in itself, a generation learning not just to survive the system, but to reshape it. And while she remained deeply committed to her work in the courtroom, she also recognized the symbolic power of her story. Public appearances, community panels, and even interviews became platforms to highlight systemic issues. The biases, the overlooked injustices, the subtle forms of oppression that persist in society. She never shied away from speaking truth, even when it made powerful people uncomfortable. The slap she had endured years earlier had been a catalyst. Now, her voice amplified justice for countless others. Yet, for all her public impact, she remained grounded in one principle. Authority is not about ego. Sitting in that chair, wielding the gavel, it would have been easy to let power reshape her. But she reminded herself daily that true authority comes from responsibility, integrity, and empathy. She understood that being a judge wasn't about reversing a single humiliation. It was about ensuring that no one, in her courtroom, would ever feel powerless again. Her story became a testament to the transformative power of courage, resilience, and unwavering commitment. The woman who had been slapped, dismissed, and underestimated had not only claimed her rightful place but had redefined what it meant to wield influence in a world designed to suppress her. Her presence, her actions, and her voice became an enduring symbol. Injustice can be challenged, and those who rise from adversity can create lasting change. With influence came scrutiny, and with scrutiny came pressure the likes of which she had never experienced. Every decision was dissected, every word weighed, every gesture analyzed. Opponents watched for missteps, critics waited for her to falter, and some colleagues whispered that she had overstepped. Yet, through it all, she remained steadfast. Authority, she realized, isn't simply about asserting power. It's about wielding it with wisdom, empathy, and unshakable integrity. High-stakes cases became her proving ground. They weren't just tests of legal skill, they were tests of character. When a defendant from a marginalized community was accused of a crime they didn't commit, she didn't rely solely on legal precedent or procedural technicalities. She listened, truly listened, to every detail, every nuance, every tear and tremor in their voice. She knew that the law, for all its rigor, is meaningless if it ignores humanity. And she applied that understanding rigorously, challenging evidence, questioning assumptions, and demanding the truth rather than the convenient narrative. Not everyone welcomed her approach. Some colleagues accused her of being soft or emotional, failing to see that empathy is not weakness, it is strength. They had learned the hard way that she would never bend to the pressures of intimidation, nor allow fear to dictate justice. In fact, her compassion often became her greatest weapon. She could disarm hostility with calm reasoning and piercing insight, turning adversaries into reluctant allies, skeptics into witnesses to integrity. The balance between authority and empathy wasn't easy to maintain. There were nights she would lie awake, haunted by the weight of her decisions. One ruling could alter lives permanently, release a guilty party, condemn the innocent, devastate families. Every judgment required precision, but also an awareness that the law is not a cold machine. It is a framework for people, flawed and beautiful, complicated and fragile. She understood that her role was not to dominate, but to guide, to illuminate the path toward justice where others had only seen shadows. As her reputation grew, so did her responsibilities. Young lawyers sought mentorship. Community leaders asked for advice. Families who had long suffered invisibility came knocking at her chambers. And yet, she treated each interaction with the same meticulous care she had shown from her earliest days in court. She recognized that her influence was a gift, not a right, and that those who had been silenced for so long deserved to be seen and heard. Every courtroom victory reinforced a lesson she had learned years ago. That power, when rooted in accountability and empathy, becomes transformative. And every challenge she faced, every smear campaign, every critical headline, every whisper of dissent, only strengthened her resolve. The woman who had once been slapped in court was no longer reacting to injustice. She was shaping it, guiding it, redirecting its course toward fairness and dignity. There were moments, however, when the weight of expectation threatened to overwhelm her. Public opinion can be fickle, the system slow to adapt, and even allies can misjudge intentions. But she had learned to navigate these treacherous waters by holding fast to her principles. She reminded herself daily that authority is not the absence of accountability, but the presence of courage, the courage to act rightly even when all eyes are upon you, even when opposition is fierce, even when mistakes could haunt you for years. By the end of each grueling day, whether in chambers or on the bench, she felt a quiet satisfaction, not from accolades or applause, but from knowing that every effort, every decision, every moment of listening and learning had contributed to a larger purpose, to redefine what justice could look like when wielded with conscience and compassion. And as she looked around the courtroom, seeing eyes once filled with doubt now reflecting respect, she knew the most profound impact of all. The understanding that dignity and fairness are not privileges. They are rights, and she was there to ensure they were upheld. Her influence extended far beyond the walls of the courtroom. Every ruling she made, every act of justice carried out with integrity, began to ripple through the community, subtly at first, then with undeniable force. People who had once felt voiceless found their confidence renewed. Neighborhoods that had long been overlooked by the system started to see hope as tangible, something they could believe in again. She had become more than a judge. She had become a symbol of possibility, a living reminder that courage and resilience could transform not just one life, but countless others. Local organizations, inspired by her example, began to push for reforms they had never dared to pursue before. School boards invited her to speak to young students about civic engagement and justice. Community centers hosted discussions on legal rights and social equity, using her story as a blueprint for empowerment. The ripple effect was unmistakable. When one person refuses to accept the status quo, it challenges everyone around them to rethink what is possible. Her actions sparked conversations, inspired initiatives, and, slowly but surely, began to shift societal expectations. Yet, with influence came intensified scrutiny. Powerful interests that had grown accustomed to complacency now felt threatened. Some politicians attempted to discredit her rulings, questioning her interpretations of the law. Certain media outlets framed her as controversial or unpredictable. She knew that every act of defiance in a system built to maintain the old order would be met with resistance. But she also knew something else. True change is never convenient, and the most lasting victories are rarely free from opposition. Her ability to navigate these challenges was remarkable. She had learned that authority is strengthened not by intimidation, but by consistency, clarity, and fairness. People who once doubted her became witnesses to her unwavering commitment. Those who had hoped to see her falter were forced to acknowledge her competence. And the community, which had once looked to her as a figure of hope, began to see her as proof that systemic change was achievable when courage intersects with opportunity. One of the most profound impacts of her work was how it inspired young women, particularly young women of color, to consider paths they had previously deemed impossible. Her story was no longer just a personal triumph. It was a roadmap. She spoke openly about her struggles, about the humiliation and doubt she had endured, and about how every setback had prepared her for the moments that truly mattered. Students and aspiring professionals began to recognize that barriers are not walls, they are challenges to be overcome. Even within the legal system, her influence began to foster subtle shifts. Colleagues started reconsidering their approaches, inspired by the efficacy of her balanced, empathetic style. Some younger lawyers adopted her model of prioritizing justice over ego, fairness over fear, and humanity over rigidity. Slowly, the culture of the courtroom itself began to change, not because she demanded it, but because she embodied it. Her presence created a living example that excellence and empathy are not mutually exclusive, they are mutually reinforcing. But perhaps the most enduring impact was personal. Individuals who had long felt invisible or silenced now walked with a sense of dignity restored. They knew that even when systems fail, courage and tenacity could create openings for change. Her story became a beacon, a reminder that no act of injustice is too small to challenge, no obstacle too great to confront, and no voice too quiet to be heard. She had turned a single moment of humiliation, the slap in the courtroom, into a lifelong mission that reshaped not only her own destiny, but the destiny of everyone who had ever looked at injustice and felt powerless. In essence, she had proven something vital. Change isn't only about authority, power, or position. It's about vision, resilience, and the unwavering belief that one person's courage can illuminate the path for countless others. Her actions, her decisions, her unwavering integrity had begun a ripple that no force could stop. And the world was watching. The case arrived quietly, almost unassuming at first, but its implications would reverberate through the city and beyond. A young man, barely out of his teens, had been accused of a crime that, on the surface, seemed open and shut. The evidence was circumstantial, the public opinion stacked against him, and the prosecutors were relentless, certain of their victory. But she saw something others did not. A truth buried beneath assumptions, a story that refused to be told. From the moment the trial began, she approached it differently. She didn't treat the young man as merely another defendant to process. She treated him as a human being. She observed him, listened to him, watched the nuances in his speech, the tremors in his hands, the subtle clues that revealed not just innocence or guilt, but the weight of a life lived under constant judgment. And she listened to the testimony of witnesses, not just for the facts they presented, but for the emotions they carried, the hidden truths between the lines. The courtroom became a stage for something far greater than the trial itself. Every ruling she made, every objection she allowed, every question she permitted was an assertion that justice was not a game to be won or lost, but a responsibility to be honored. Prosecutors grew frustrated as their usual tactics, the intimidation, the repetition, the theatricality, fell flat under her unwavering focus. Defense attorneys leaned in closer, recognizing a rare ally in the pursuit of truth. And the young man, once on the brink of despair, began to feel something he had never known in a courtroom: hope. Her rulings were precise, authoritative, and infused with empathy. When evidence was misleading or misrepresented, she called it out with clarity that left no room for manipulation. When witnesses wavered, she guided the questioning to reveal the underlying truth without coercion or humiliation. Every moment of the trial was measured, deliberate, yet infused with the humanity that had always defined her approach. People in the gallery began to whisper, not in doubt, but in awe. They were witnessing mastery, the rare balance of authority and compassion, intellect and intuition, law and morality. The climax of the case came not from dramatic revelations or courtroom theatrics, but from a simple, undeniable truth. Justice cannot be served when fear dictates decisions. With a calm but firm voice, she summarized the evidence, highlighted the inconsistencies, and exposed the assumptions that had threatened to condemn an innocent life. The verdict, when it came, was a triumph not only for the young man but for the principles she embodied. Innocence was affirmed, and accountability, for those who sought to distort the process, was imposed. What was remarkable, however, was the aftermath. News of the ruling spread like wildfire, not only because of the case itself, but because of how it had been handled. Lawyers, judges, activists, and citizens took note. Here was someone who had transformed the courtroom from a place of intimidation into a space where truth and justice prevailed. The young man's family wept openly, not just for relief, but for the restoration of faith in a system that had long seemed indifferent to their struggles. Her reputation, already formidable, now reached an entirely new level. People spoke not only of her courage and intellect but of her humanity, the rare quality that elevated her from a judge to a symbol of what justice could and should be. Young lawyers sought mentorship, students wrote letters of admiration, and communities that had once felt powerless began to believe that their voices mattered. Her rulings had tangible effects, yes, but her approach had intangible ones that would echo for years. Empathy and authority need not exist in opposition. They can coexist, harmoniously, and reshape a system built on imbalance. That case became a defining moment, the kind of trial that every judge dreams of presiding over, yet few have the courage and insight to truly honor. And through it, she demonstrated something profound. Power wielded with integrity, intelligence, and compassion doesn't just enforce the law, it inspires transformation. And in that courtroom, on that fateful day, a young man's life was saved, a community's faith restored, and a legacy solidified for generations to come. Word of her courtroom victories spread far beyond the city limits. News outlets, initially skeptical of the young black woman who had taken the judge's chair in defiance, now featured her prominently. Headlines described her as fearless, unorthodox, even revolutionary. Social media amplified every moment. Clips of her rulings, interviews with families whose lives she had transformed, and discussions dissecting her approach circulated across the country. She had become more than a local phenomenon. She was a national symbol of justice and resilience. With visibility came new pressures. People projected their hopes, frustrations, and expectations onto her, as if she alone could solve systemic issues that had persisted for decades. Every decision she made was scrutinized not only by her peers and the press but by citizens who had never stepped foot in a courtroom. Praise was abundant, but criticism was sharp. Letters, emails, and even calls flooded her office daily, demanding explanations, accountability, and solutions to problems she couldn't solve alone. The weight of expectation was enormous, and she felt it keenly. Yet, she didn't falter. She reminded herself that being a symbol doesn't mean being infallible. It means embodying principles that others can look up to while remaining grounded in reality. She accepted interviews and speeches not for fame, but to highlight systemic problems and inspire action. She spoke about the importance of access to justice, the need for legal reforms, and the value of empathy in positions of power. Her voice became a conduit for change, carrying messages that might otherwise have been ignored. The recognition also brought invitations to speak at national conferences, universities, and legal forums. She was asked to participate in panels discussing criminal justice reform, racial equity, and community empowerment. While she appreciated these opportunities, she approached each engagement with care, knowing that words can inspire or be misconstrued. Her goal wasn't to be a celebrity. It was to be a catalyst, and she approached every stage, every microphone, with the same measured authority she brought to the courtroom. Behind the public acclaim, however, was the reality of her daily work. Cases continued to pile up, each with its own complexities and moral dilemmas. She spent long nights reviewing evidence, deliberating over judgments, and consulting colleagues. She had learned that national attention could be a double-edged sword. It brought influence, but also constant scrutiny and unrealistic expectations. She reminded herself constantly that real change happens in the details, in the quiet, relentless commitment to fairness, not just in the moments that make headlines. Her colleagues' reactions were varied. Some admired her courage and ingenuity, acknowledging that her approach elevated the entire judicial system. Others grew wary, uneasy with the scrutiny and attention she attracted. Some tried to isolate her, whispering doubts and criticisms, but she had learned long ago not to be swayed by gossip or envy. She remained focused on the work, knowing that the truest measure of her impact would be the lives she changed, not the headlines she made. The community, meanwhile, embraced her story. Parents told their children about her determination. Lawyers cited her example in discussions of ethics and justice. And young activists saw her as proof that change was possible when courage meets persistence. She was no longer just a judge. She had become a beacon of possibility, a symbol that one person's actions, guided by principle, resilience, and empathy, can inspire an entire nation to reconsider what is fair, what is just, and what is possible. And through it all, she remained humble. She knew that recognition and acclaim, while gratifying, were not the goal. The goal had always been justice, not for herself, but for those who had been denied it. Every decision she made, every case she adjudicated, every word she spoke in public reflected that commitment. She had transformed a single act of defiance, taking the judge's chair in the face of humiliation, into a lifelong mission to redefine justice for all. And in doing so, she had inspired a movement that would endure far beyond her own time. Fame, even when earned through courage and integrity, is rarely kind. She discovered this truth as her influence expanded nationally. Invitations to speak, media appearances, and public recognition were exhilarating, yet they came with an invisible weight, a constant pressure to live up to an image that was both inspiring and exacting. Every misstep, every judgment, every pause or hesitation became a potential headline. For someone who had spent years fighting to be heard, this was a different kind of battle. A battle to remain true to herself amid the noise of expectation. The personal toll was subtle at first. Late nights reviewing cases turned into exhaustion that no cup of coffee could cure. Travel for speaking engagements, panels, and interviews left her physically drained. And behind the scenes, there was an emotional weight she carried alone. The faces of the people who relied on her, the families whose fates hung on her decisions, and the communities that had begun to see her as more than a judge, a symbol of hope. The expectations were immense, and the stakes unrelenting. Yet she discovered resilience in the smallest rituals. A quiet morning with a notebook allowed her to reflect on the cases, the people, and the lessons she had learned. She journaled not only to organize her thoughts, but to remind herself why she had begun this journey. The injustice she had faced, the slap in the courtroom, and the voices that had once been silenced but were now amplified through her actions. These moments of reflection became her anchor, a way to maintain clarity amid the swirl of public attention and professional demands. Support systems became essential. Close friends and trusted colleagues offered perspective, grounding her when the world seemed too loud. Family provided a touchstone, a reminder that beyond the spotlight, she was still human, with fears, doubts, and vulnerabilities like anyone else. And in quiet moments, she allowed herself to process the emotions she often suppressed in the courtroom. Anger at injustice, sorrow for those harmed by systemic failures, and even the occasional pang of loneliness that comes from being constantly in the public eye. She also learned to set boundaries. Public engagement was crucial, but overexposure could dilute her effectiveness. She learned to choose carefully which cases to highlight, which panels to attend, and when to simply focus on the work itself. Her presence was powerful not because it was ubiquitous, but because it was deliberate, intentional, and authentic. Every appearance, every word, every decision was a statement of purpose, not a performance for approval. The lessons of resilience were rooted in her early experiences. The humiliation she endured, the barriers she had shattered, and the persistence that carried her through adversity all informed the way she navigated her current challenges. She understood that resilience is not about enduring passively. It is about acting deliberately, about choosing courage every single day, even when the weight of expectation threatens to collapse under its own force. And through it all, she maintained her humanity. She didn't let the national spotlight define her. She didn't seek validation from the press or the applause of strangers. Instead, she measured success by the lives touched, the justice delivered, and the examples set for those who came after her. Fame was a tool, a platform, but not the purpose. The purpose was, and always had been, justice, empathy, and the relentless pursuit of truth. In the quiet of her office, after the lights dimmed and the last visitor departed, she allowed herself a moment to breathe. The journey had been long, painful, and challenging, but it had also been transformative. Every challenge, every setback, every moment of doubt had contributed to the woman she had become. A judge who could wield authority with compassion, a leader who could inspire change, and a human being who refused to let adversity define her limits. And in that quiet reflection, she found the strength to continue, to face the next day, the next case, and the next opportunity to redefine justice for everyone who had been overlooked, underestimated, or dismissed. As her career progressed, she realized that the most enduring impact of her work would not be measured by headlines or accolades, but by the people she empowered to carry the torch forward. Mentorship became a central focus. Young lawyers, particularly those from marginalized backgrounds, sought her guidance, eager to learn not just the mechanics of the law, but the art of wielding authority with integrity and empathy. She shared her journey openly. The setbacks, the humiliations, the moments of doubt, and the triumphs. Each story became a lesson, each conversation a blueprint for courage. She taught them that justice is not simply a matter of following procedure. It is a responsibility to understand the human stories behind every case. That fairness requires listening, patience, and a willingness to challenge assumptions. That authority, when wielded without conscience, can oppress, but when combined with empathy, it transforms communities. Her protégés learned that the courtroom is not only a stage for decisions, but a place where values are demonstrated, where the dignity of every individual matters, and where courage can rewrite the rules. Beyond mentorship, she continued to shape her legacy through her rulings, community involvement, and advocacy. Schools invited her to speak on civic engagement, and legal forums highlighted her innovative approaches. Her story became a catalyst for systemic change, inspiring reforms, influencing policy discussions, and motivating ordinary citizens to demand fairness in every corner of society. She understood that her role had evolved. She was no longer just a judge. She was a symbol, a teacher, and a beacon for those who had been silenced for too long. Yet, despite the recognition, she remained grounded. She knew that true power is measured not by fame or authority, but by the lasting impact on others' lives. Every decision, every mentorship session, every public appearance was driven by a single principle. Justice must be accessible, compassionate, and unwavering. She understood that her greatest victories were not the dramatic reversals or courtroom triumphs, but the subtle, profound transformations she witnessed in those she touched. The lawyers who now approached cases with integrity, the students who dared to dream bigger, the families who found hope where they once saw despair. In the end, her journey had come full circle. From the moment she had been slapped in court, underestimated and dismissed, to the moment she sat in the judge's chair commanding respect, she had turned adversity into opportunity. She had demonstrated that courage is not the absence of fear, that resilience is not simply surviving, and that authority is most powerful when guided by empathy. Her life became a testament to the idea that one person, unafraid to claim their place, can inspire a generation, reshape institutions, and create a legacy that endures far beyond a single courtroom. And now, as we reflect on her story, it's not just a tale to be admired. It's a call to action. If her journey has inspired you, if her courage has moved you, then take a step today. Subscribe, leave a comment, share your thoughts, and give a like to support stories that matter. Because change begins with awareness, and awareness begins with engagement. Stand up, speak out, and remember, just as she claimed her seat when no one expected it, you too can claim your space in the world and transform it with courage, empathy, and relentless determination.